The bulldozers didn't arrive with a court order, they arrived with confidence. At sunrise in southern Burkina Faso, a 70-year-old farmer named Musa stood barefoot in the dust as yellow steel rolled toward his home. The engines were loud. Too loud. Not the sound of work, but the sound of erasure. From the back seat of a black luxury SUV, a government minister watched and laughed. In his hands were official papers. Stamped. Signed. Approved. Documents designed to end arguments before they began. They were fake. For Musa, this land was not a possession. It was his life. 10 acres passed down through 3 generations. Soil that fed his children. Trees that shaded his parents. A river that had never dried, until corruption found it valuable. But corruption doesn't see history, it sees opportunity. The minister, powerful, protected, untouchable, saw profit where Musa saw survival. A future resort. A private escape for people who never asked whose land it was. When Musa said no, the law changed. Records were altered overnight. Clerks were paid. Reality was rewritten. And when paper was no longer enough, muscle arrived. Men with batons stepped out of SUVs and delivered a simple message. Government land. Leave in 48 hours, or everything disappears. Musa had no lawyer, the police were already bought, the mayor was already silent. This is where stories like this usually end. An old man on his knees, machines finishing the job. But corruption made one fatal mistake. It believed fear travels faster than truth. It doesn't. Because while the bulldozers were warming up, someone far more dangerous was already watching. And when he arrived, the machines stopped. Not by force by authority. What happened next didn't just save one farmer's land. It changed the rules for an entire country. The sound reached the village before the convoy did. A low, steady rumble. Not the chaos of construction machines, but the disciplined growl of engines moving in formation. The bulldozer operator paused. The men with batons turned their heads. Even the minister in the SUV stopped laughing. From the horizon, a line of military vehicles cut through the dust. They weren't speeding, they didn't need to. When the lead vehicle stopped, silence followed. Not fear. Authority. Doors opened. Boots hit the ground in unison. And then a man stepped forward. Ibrahim Traoré. No cameras. No speeches. No entourage asking for permission. He didn't look at the minister first. He walked past him. Past the SUV. Past the men with batons. Straight toward Musa. The old farmer was still on his knees. Traore stopped in front of him and waited. He did not rush him. He did not pull him up for the cameras. He waited until Musa found the strength to stand on his own. "Is this your land?" Traore asked. Musa nodded. "How long?" "Since my grandfather," Musa said. His voice shook, but his words didn't. Traore turned slowly and faced the bulldozers. Then the soldiers. Then the minister. "Show me the documents." The minister smiled again. Confident. Relaxed. He handed over the folder like a man who had done this many times before. Stamps. Seals. Signatures. Everything looked perfect. Traore flipped through the pages once. Then twice. And then he stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply asked one question. Who signed this? The minister answered quickly. Too quickly. He named a clerk. A mid-level official. Someone who couldn't defend himself. Traore nodded. Calm. Almost polite. Bring him here, he said. Within minutes, a nervous man arrived. Pale. Sweating. Unable to meet anyone's eyes. Traore held up the document. Did you sign this? The clerk hesitated. That hesitation lasted less than a second. It was enough. Traore turned to his aide. Call the land registry. Now. The call was put on speaker. Records were checked live. Dates didn't match. Serial numbers conflicted. Files that should exist didn't. Reality began to collapse. The minister shifted in place. The smile vanished. His SUV suddenly looked very small. Traore closed the folder. These papers are forged, he said. Flat. Final. Then he looked at the bulldozer operator. Turn off the engine. The operator hesitated. He looked at the minister. Traore didn't raise his voice that he didn't need to. I said. Turn it off. The engine died. Dust settled. Birds returned to the trees. For the first time that morning, the village could hear itself breathe. Traore stepped closer to the minister. You ordered this demolition. The minister tried to speak. He said words like development, investment, national interest. Traore let him finish. Then he spoke. You used the state to steal from a citizen. Silence. You forged records. Silence. You sent armed men to intimidate an old farmer. Silence. Traore turned to the soldiers. Detain him. The minister froze. You can't. They didn't touch him roughly. They didn't shout. They simply opened the door and waited. Power does not argue when it has ended. As the minister was escorted away, Traore turned back to Musa. This land is yours, he said. No one will touch it again. Musa tried to speak. He couldn't. His hands trembled. Tears cut clean lines through the dust on his face. Traore placed a hand on his shoulder. This country does not belong to those who steal, he said. It belongs to those who endure. Then he turned back to his convoy. The bulldozers never moved again. By nightfall, the story had spread beyond the village. By morning, every corrupt official in the country understood the message. This was not a warning. This was a change of rules. And for the first time in a long time, the powerful were afraid. The arrest didn't make headlines at first. There was no press release. No official announcement. Just a minister who didn't come home that night, a phone that kept ringing unanswered, and a convoy that left a village without a single bulldozer moving again. But power has a sensitive nervous system. By midnight, whispers were already spreading through government offices. At 2 a.m, lights were still on in ministries that usually slept. By dawn, files were being moved. Phones were being wiped. Documents quietly disappeared into fires and shredders. The message had landed. It wasn't about Musa. It wasn't about land. It was about precedent. For years, corruption in Burkina Faso followed an unspoken rule: steal carefully, share upward, and never touch the poor too visibly. That rule was gone now. The shield was cracked. And everyone knew who had cracked it. Inside the capital, senior officials replayed the same thought in their minds. If it happened to him, it can happen to me. Some tried to downplay it. They told themselves it was symbolic. A one-time gesture. A performance for the people. But symbols don't detain ministers. Symbols don't summon registries in real time. Symbols don't turn engines off with a single sentence. This was enforcement. By the second day, calls started coming in from unexpected places. Land officers asking for clarification. Mayors requesting guidance. Police commanders suddenly discovering old cases they wanted to reopen. Fear had changed direction. And outside government buildings, something else was happening. People were talking. In markets. On buses. In farming villages that had never appeared on a map. They repeated the story in fragments, each version growing bolder than the last. An old man. Fake papers. A minister arrested in front of his own machines. For years, people had learned to whisper. Now they were remembering how to speak. Musa's village became a pilgrimage. Not for journalists, but for farmers. For widows. For men who had lost land quietly and assumed no one would ever hear them. They came to stand on the edge of the fields and look at the soil as if it had changed color. It hadn't. But the rules around it had. And inside the government, panic took shape. Some officials rushed to distance themselves. They released statements about transparency. Others went quiet, hoping invisibility would save them. A few tried to reach out through intermediaries, testing whether forgiveness was possible. They all received the same silence. Because the real shock wasn't the arrest. It was what followed. Land audits were ordered. Quietly. Methodically. Files once considered untouchable were reopened. Deals signed years ago were suddenly questioned. And for the first time in decades, corruption felt time-bound. Past actions were no longer buried. They were cued. This terrified people more than public trials ever could. Because uncertainty is worse than punishment. In the villages, something subtle but dangerous was growing. Expectation. When people stop expecting justice, they survive. When they start expecting it, they demand it. And that demand doesn't stay polite for long. The leadership understood this. They understood that this moment could not be half measures. That backing down now would not restore fear. It would invite fury. So the line held. No speeches. No victory tours, just action. And that restraint made it stronger. Because the country wasn't watching a savior perform. It was watching a system reset. By the end of the week, one truth had settled across Burkina Faso like a low hum in the ground. The era where power protected theft was ending. Not announced, not negotiated. Enforced. And as Musa stood again on his land, not as a victim but as an owner, people understood something even more dangerous than fear. They understood possibility. And once people believe change is possible, they become impossible to control. The silence that followed was deliberate. No celebration. No announcement of victory. No promise that everything was now fixed. Because real change does not shout. It warns. In the capital, meetings grew shorter. Words were chosen carefully. People who once spoke loudly now listened first. The air had shifted. Not with joy, but with awareness. A line had been crossed. And everyone knew it could not be uncrossed. Ibrahim Traoré did not tour the country to explain what happened. He did not need to. The message was already clear. This was not about one farmer, this was not about one minister, this was about the future. For decades, corruption survived because it felt permanent. Because people believed nothing could touch it. That belief was its strongest shield. Now that shield was cracked. And cracks change behavior. Officials began to ask questions they had never asked before. Not out of morality. Out of survival. Deals slowed. Signatures hesitated. Silence became safer than ambition. But the most important shift did not happen inside offices. It happened in people's minds. For the first time in a long time, citizens were not waiting to be disappointed. They were watching closely. Measuring actions. Connecting patterns. Understanding that power responds to pressure when pressure is organized. Hope returned, but not the soft kind. The dangerous kind. Because hope makes people brave. And brave people do not accept old rules. This is where every nation faces a choice. Change can be guided, or it can be forced. The warning was simple. Corruption would no longer be tolerated quietly, power would no longer be invisible, and the distance between the ruler and the ruled would no longer protect abuse. But warnings are not threats. They are invitations. An invitation to officials to choose accountability over greed. An invitation to institutions to reform before they collapse. And an invitation to citizens to remain awake. Because justice does not survive on leaders alone. It survives on memory. On attention. On refusal to forget. What happened to Musa proved something essential. That when the state stands with the weakest, it regains legitimacy, and when legitimacy returns, fear changes sides. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a test. A test of consistency. A test of courage. A test of whether power can serve without consuming. The future of Burkina Faso will not be decided by speeches or slogans. It will be decided by whether this moment becomes a pattern, or remains an exception. That decision belongs to more than one man. It belongs to everyone watching. Because once people have seen justice act, they will not accept silence again. And once silence is broken, there is no going back. This is the warning. Not shouted, not threatened, but delivered. The country is watching, the people are awake. And the next chapter will be written by those who refused to look away. What followed was not applause. It was alignment. Across the country, small decisions began to change. Quietly. Incrementally. A land officer refusing a bribe for the first time. A mayor delaying a signature instead of rushing it. A police commander choosing procedure over orders whispered in hallways. None of this made headlines. That was the point. Because real reform does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives with habits. With repetition. With the slow, uncomfortable realization that the old shortcuts no longer work. In Musa's village, the land looked the same. The trees stood where they always had. The river flowed as it always had. But the people did not look at it the same way anymore. They no longer saw soil that could be taken at any moment. They saw ground that could be defended. Children asked questions their parents had stopped asking years ago. Elders spoke of the past not as a warning, but as a lesson. And for the first time, people talked about the future without lowering their voices. In offices where deals were once sealed with a nod, there was hesitation. Not because everyone had suddenly become virtuous, but because risk had changed shape. Corruption was no longer invisible. It had weight. It had consequence. It had memory. That memory mattered. Because power fears one thing more than outrage: consistency. A single act can be dismissed. A pattern cannot. And a pattern was forming. Ibrahim Traoré did not claim credit for this shift. He did not frame it as a personal victory. He understood something many leaders forget: if justice depends on a name, it dies with that name. So the focus remained where it belonged. On the rules, on the process, on the expectation that authority answers to truth, not the other way around. This is how legacies are built. Not by speeches that fade, not by slogans that age, but by systems that remember. The warning delivered earlier had now become a standard. And standards are dangerous to those who profit from disorder. That is why the work was not finished. And why it could never be finished by one moment, one arrest, or one story. The future would test this resolve. There would be resistance. There would be attempts to return to the old ways, dressed in new language. There always are. But something irreversible had already happened. People had seen power stop, they had seen lies collapse. They had seen the state stand with the weakest and not retreat. And once that image exists, it cannot be erased. This is the legacy. Not perfection, not purity, but direction. A direction where fear no longer belongs to the innocent, where silence is no longer the safest choice, where truth, once spoken, is defended. What happens next will depend on vigilance. On whether people continue to watch, to question, to remember. Because justice is not self-sustaining. It must be chosen again. And again. And again. This story does not end here. It continues wherever power meets the people, and the people refuse to look away. And now, the responsibility shifts. Not to the man who stopped the bulldozers, not to the soldiers who turned off the engines, but to everyone who witnessed what power looks like when it chooses restraint over greed. Because moments like this do not last by default. They last only if they are protected. Ibrahim Traoré understood this from the beginning. That is why there was no triumph. No declaration that the fight was over. Only a quiet insistence on standards, on procedure, on consequence. He knew something essential. That justice is not fragile because it is weak, that it is fragile because it is rare. And rare things attract pressure. There will be voices that say this was an exception. That it cannot be repeated. That stability requires compromise. That silence is safer than accountability. Those voices are already rehearsing their arguments. They always do. This is where the choice becomes real. A nation can remember what it felt like to see power hesitate, or it can forget, and return to what feels familiar. Familiar corruption, familiar excuses, familiar fear. But forgetting now would be a decision, not an accident. Because once people have seen the rules enforced, pretending otherwise becomes impossible. Once the public understands that authority can be held, unaccountable power loses its mystique. And mystique is the oxygen of corruption. The future will not be decided by how loud people cheer. It will be decided by how closely they watch. By whether questions continue to be asked. By whether silence is challenged when it returns wearing a new face. This is not a call to outrage. Outrage burns fast and disappears. This is a call to attention. Attention is slower. Heavier. More dangerous. It forces systems to behave. It forces leaders to choose. It forces history to move. What happened to Musa was small in scale. One field. One village. One act of theft stopped in time. But its meaning was not small. It proved that power can still be interrupted. That the distance between the citizen and the state is not unbridgeable. That fear is not the final authority. And that proof now belongs to everyone. So the question is no longer what leaders will do next. The question is what people will accept next. Because the moment corruption realizes it is no longer invisible, it adapts. And the moment people stop watching, it returns. This is the choice. To stay awake.to remember.to demand consistency, not miracles. Because justice does not arrive once. It arrives every time people refuse to look away. And this time, they are watching.